Good morning, and welcome to Life Point's Sunday morning worship. As you can see, we are again in Rebecca and Andrew's living room, though you might notice that there's a little less sunlight coming through our window than there probably is on your window right now. That's because we are recording this on Thursday evening in preparation to release it live on Sunday morning. When the governor's announcement came out yesterday, that would be Wednesday. Yeah, that's right. When the governor's announcement came out Wednesday that we are essentially having a stay at home for 2 weeks, his announcement did have accommodations for faith communities, and we actually could be filming this live on Sunday morning, and a lot of churches this morning are filming live. However, to be honest, when the governor came out yesterday and made the statement that even with existing measures that we're taking as a state, we're still expecting there to be 3 to 6 weeks in which the need for ICU beds for Minnesotans actually exceeds the number of ICU beds that we have. That bothered us, and we kind of talked about this and decided if staying at home for 2 weeks is what we can do to help keep Minnesotans safe and healthy, then we're willing to do the extra work of recording ahead of time and piecing things together. Has there ever been anything that no matter how hard you tried, you just couldn't understand it, and yet you also couldn't ignore it? In school, growing up as a student, I had something of a love-hate relationship with mathematics, like so many students. But the nature of my love-hate relationship with mathematics was that as I learned mathematics, if I could understand why and how an equation worked, if I could wrap my head around why it made sense, then I could use equations all day long. But if I couldn't figure out why something worked, it was very, very difficult for me to just plug in equations and just remember equations. For this reason, in my 25 years of school, I can't think of anything that I struggled with more than what's called imaginary numbers. Now, if you haven't been in school for a while and need a little bit of a refresher, conceptually speaking, any number multiplied by itself should produce a positive number. So a positive number times a positive number equals a positive number. A negative number times a negative number equals a positive number. And so when you're doing things like square roots, in other words, what number multiplied by itself equals 4? Well, 2. 2 times 2 equals 4. Or the square root of 9, 3 times 3 equals 9. However, you shouldn't be able to have a square root of a negative number. You shouldn't be able to have a number that a different number multiplied by itself equals a negative number. However, when physicists study electricity, one of the things that they observe is that we can't account for electricity without what's called imaginary numbers, which is the square root of a negative 1, the square root of a negative number. And so we have a problem here, because when looking at this from the mathematics side, you shouldn't be able to have imaginary numbers. They should be just conceptual, philosophical things that don't really exist in the real world. But from the scientific side, we can't ignore something like electricity. And so in order to understand electricity, we have to use something like an imaginary number, then what do you do with that? And so I had to use, in math class, we had to use imaginary numbers because it was in our curriculum. But I just couldn't wrap my head around that. And so I vividly remember struggling horribly with using imaginary numbers. However, as much trouble as as much trouble as imaginary numbers caused for me as a student in high school, there's something else that over the large degree of my life, or the large course of my life, that has really caused me even more difficulty because I can't understand it and yet I can't ignore it. The video that you're about to see was the very first video shown on my very first day of my very first marriage counseling class. So keep that in mind as you watch this video.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
Yeah, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't!
Now, I've shown this video to lots of married couples. And I'll bet if you're a man, you just watched that video and you're thinking, that's so funny. Obviously, the problem is the nail. However, if you're a woman, I'm willing to bet that your first thought was, why can't he just listen to her? And I'll be honest, I'm 100% man. 100% man, and I cannot understand. I just can't. I cannot understand how a person might want to vent about a problem and not fix it, but just talk about it. And yet in my interactions with my wife and with family members who are women and with friends who are women and congregation members who are women, I hear this over and over again from people that I love and respect, and that this idea of, I don't want you to fix it, I just want you to listen. And that makes no sense to me. That neither makes any sense to me, nor can I relate to that. Because when I have a problem in my life, if I think that it might be able to be fixed, I want to at least try and fix it. And if you have advice, I would love to hear it. Yeah, and so it's one of those things, because that sentiment makes no sense to me, and because I can't relate emotionally. What do you do? What do you do? And yet, in those situations, because it makes no sense to me, and because I can't relate emotionally, I have to consciously choose to trust that, for instance, when my wife tells me, I don't want you to fix it, just listen to me, that she knows what she's talking about. And so I do. And it's amazing how often that situation comes up. And so, and so when it doesn't make sense to me, and when I can't relate, I have to choose to trust. Now, in our story this morning from John chapter 11, we're going to find that that there are times in which Jesus does things or says things that just I can't make any sense of. I don't understand Jesus' motivation for saying or doing the things that he does. And when I can't relate to his situation, sometimes I just have to trust him. Sometimes I just have to choose to trust him. In our story this morning, we look at Jesus' healing of his friend named Lazarus. And as a part of the story, what we're going to see is we're going to see three different groups of people who struggle to recognize who Jesus is, or to lean into who Jesus is in the midst of this situation and what that means for them. As we talk about these three different groups of people, and as we work our way through this story, I want you to be thinking, in the midst of this season of life, this coronavirus, shut down, stay at home, working less, being with my family more season of life, which of these three groups of people do you relate to most easily? As our story opens, we find that one of Jesus' friends named Lazarus has fallen ill. And it's kind of ill where the doctors call in the family and tell the family, you probably should say your goodbyes. It's that kind of ill. It's the kind of ill where without intervention, the expectation is this guy's probably going to pass. In this particular story, it just so happens that this friend Lazarus, his closest family are two characters that we already know from other stories within the Gospels, specifically Mary Magdalene and her sister Martha. Having been with Jesus for some time, Mary and Martha send word to Jesus that Lazarus is very ill, and they ask him to come and heal his brother and heal their brother. And we see Jesus talking to his disciples about this situation and assuring them that this story is not going to end in Lazarus's death. And then we see Jesus doing something a little bit confusing. We see, rather than going ahead and coming on to the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, we see Jesus waiting for 2 more days. See, in that culture, the common thought was that when a person died, their soul hovered around their body for up to 3 days. But at the end of that 3-day period, the body would lose its color, and the belief was that at that point the body had been dead for too long, that the soul would then depart and go to the afterlife. And so in choosing to stay for 2 more days and making sure that by the time Jesus got to Lazarus and healed him, Jesus always planned to heal him. But by the time Jesus arrived, making sure that he arrived after that 3-day period, Jesus made sure that for whoever happened to be there watching, that what Jesus was about to do was more glorious and more powerful and more miraculous than anything that those people had ever seen or had ever heard of. Now, let's read together the first part of this story and take a look at what the disciples' response is when Jesus finally tells them it's time for us to go to Judea to visit Lazarus and Mary and Martha.
John chapter 11, verses 1 through 16. A man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters, Mary and Martha. This is the Mary who later poured the expensive perfume on the Lord's feet and wiped them with her hair. Her brother, Lazarus, was sick. So the 2 sisters sent a message to Jesus telling him, "Lord, your dear friend is very sick." But when Jesus heard about it, he said, "Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this." So although Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for the next 2 days. Finally, he said to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." But his disciples objected. "Rabbi," they said, "only a few days ago the people in Judea were trying to stone you. Are you going there again?" Jesus replied, "There are 12 hours of daylight every day. During the day, people can walk safely. They can see because they have the light of this world. But at night, there is danger of stumbling because they have no light." Then he said, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him up." The disciples said, "Lord, if he is sleeping, he will soon get better." They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping, But Jesus meant Lazarus had died. So he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there. For now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him. Thomas, nicknamed the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let's go too and die with Jesus.
After the declaration that Lazarus was sick, and after Jesus felt that he had waited around for the appropriate amount of time, he finally let his disciples know that it was time for them to return to Judea. And the disciples responded mostly with fear. Specifically, they were afraid of the religious leaders. See, by that time in Jesus' ministry, he had made pretty good enemies of the religious leaders in Jerusalem, and the religious leaders in Jerusalem had a lot of power, and they could make life hard for somebody like Jesus and his disciples. And so the disciples sort of pushed back against Jesus. Do we really want to do this? Throughout the passage, we see the disciples contending with Jesus that it isn't safe in Jerusalem, and even sort of deflecting a little bit and asking Jesus if maybe Lazarus would get better on his own. But Jesus speaks truth into the situation and reminds them of things like the fact that he is the light, and they don't need to walk in darkness because they have the light there with them. He also speaks very plainly about how Lazarus had fallen asleep, but he needed Jesus to go there to wake him up. And then even a little further, a little later on, Jesus is very, very blunt and says, no, Lazarus has died. But the disciples, they just can't seem to wrap their heads around the fact that if they went with Jesus, following in his footsteps, it was going to be okay. Instead, we see them, or at least we see Thomas, perhaps on the part of the whole of the disciples, resigning themselves to something sort of like a resigned fatalism and saying, well, we're going to go with Jesus, and so Lazarus has died, and we'll just go to Jerusalem or go to Judea and die right alongside Lazarus. For a group of people who had walked so far with Jesus and for so long, they just couldn't grasp who Jesus was and what that meant for them in their circumstances. Let's take just a moment and look at the next group of verses and see how Martha's response to Jesus differs a little bit from the disciples.
John 11:17 through 27. When Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in his grave for 4 days. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus told her, "Your brother will rise again." "Yes," Martha said, "he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day." Jesus told her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live, even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die." "Do you believe this, Martha?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I have always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God."
Whereas the disciples' response to Jesus in this story seems to focus around fear, Martha's response to Jesus seems to focus around her theology. By the time that Jesus arrives, a relatively large group of Jews from Jerusalem have arrived to help comfort Mary and Martha in their grief. The Greek text states that the distance from Mary and Martha's house to Jerusalem was 16 stadia. And a stadia was the approximate length of a Roman stadium, which was a little over 600 feet. And so multiply that times 16 and you get a little under 2 miles. So easily a short enough distance for people to walk from their homes in Jerusalem to be with Mary and Martha in their time of grief. And so when it's made known to Martha that Jesus had finally come to visit them, We see Martha going outside of the city to meet with Jesus and leaving Mary at home in the house in the traditional place of mourning. And over the next few verses, we see a conversation in which Jesus keeps trying to point Martha to who he is in the midst of the reality of the situation. But it's as if Martha has trouble thinking outside of theological concepts. Jesus tells Martha, for instance, that Lazarus will rise again, and Martha immediately goes to the common theological concept of the Jews of that day that all of the Jews would rise again in the end times. And then Jesus tells Martha that he is the resurrection and he is the life, and asks Martha if she believes it, and it's so interesting. What she says is, I believe that you are the Messiah. And if we're not careful, then what we hear there is a statement of faith. And it is kind of a statement of faith, but what we have to understand is that what we think of when we hear Messiah, we think of what we know Jesus to be as God himself, as God incarnate, and his identity as Savior of the world in the sense that he took away the sin and the death in the world. But that's not the type of Messiah that the Jews of that day were expecting. They were expecting a Messiah in the sense of a human that was sent by God to rescue the people from Roman oppression, and a son of God in the sense of in the same way that Hercules was a son of a god. They were not looking for God himself to come and rescue people and return and solidify a relationship with the Father. And so we got to be careful and realize what we're seeing here is not a strong faith statement on the part of Martha, which is affirmed at the end when we see Martha not wanting Jesus to roll away the stone. But it is Martha. It's Martha using her theological statements to not have to deal with the reality of what's going on here. In the midst of the season that we're in right now, can you relate to the idea of punting to the right answer, the right theological answers to questions, so that you don't really have to wrestle with the questions themselves? So many of us know the right answers. We know to say, well, God's in control. We know to say that God has a purpose, that God can work miracles. We know all of that verbiage, but do you ever find yourself using that as a way to just not have to deal with the reality of the situation? I know I sometimes do. Let's take one more look at the next few verses and finally look at how Mary, Martha's sister, and how her response to Jesus differs from that both of Martha and also from the disciples.
John chapter 11, verses 28 through 32. Then Martha returned to Mary. She called Mary aside from the mourners and told her, "The teacher is here and wants to see you." So Mary immediately went to him. Jesus had stayed outside the village at the place where Martha met him. When the people who were at the house consoling Mary saw her leave so hastily, they assumed she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep. So they followed her there. When Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died."
Whereas the disciples responded to Jesus in fear, and we see Martha responding with her theology, Mary responds with sadness. But in order to understand this piece, we first have to understand a little bit about funerals in that day. For the Jewish culture, they were really legalistic about a lot of things, but one of the things that they were legalistic about was about how to show strong emotion. And so one of the practices of the culture of that day was to actually employ professional musicians and mourners to provide an atmosphere of grief and mourning for the loved ones of a deceased person, to help entice them to release that strong emotion in the midst of a culture that really wasn't in the habit of showing such strong negative emotion. And so it seems that perhaps that's what is going on at the beginning of these verses about Mary. However, when she hears that Jesus has come, she immediately pops up and goes to Jesus. And when she gets to Jesus, we see her so overcome with emotion that she falls down on her knees and begins to weep, to weep with Jesus. And what we see in her statement, that if you had been here, Lazarus would not have died, it's not an attack, it's not even a complaint. What we see is resignation. We see a resignation of the finality of Lazarus' death. And so in what we could read to be Mary humbly kneeling at Jesus' feet and making a statement of faith, isn't really that. It is Mary being so overwhelmed and overcome with grief that she forgets whose presence she's in. She forgets whose presence she's in, and she just crumbles. Now, while we might be able to empathize and relate with Mary, I got to be honest, of all of the groups that are in this story, I'm most bothered by Mary's response here, because Mary Magdalene is one of those characters that we see some of the most profound instances of humility and worship and surrender throughout all of the Gospels. We see Mary sitting at Jesus' feet, just sitting at Jesus' feet and listening to him, despite a ragged tongue lashing from her sister, simply because she wanted to be with Jesus. We see Mary breaking open an enormously valuable bottle of perfume, and from the perspective of some watching, wasting it on washing and perfuming Jesus' feet simply because it's the best that she had. And yet in this story, we see that she has allowed her grief to so overwhelm her that she forgets that she is standing in the presence of the one who spoke the seas into existence, the one who knit her together in her mother's womb. Can you relate to Mary in this part of the story? Or perhaps you relate better to the disciples or to Martha.
John chapter 11, verses 33 through 44. When Jesus saw Mary weeping and saw the other people wailing with her, a deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. "Where have you put Lazarus?" he asked them. They told him, "Lord, come and see." Then Jesus wept. The people who were standing nearby said, "See how much he loved him." But some said, "This man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying?" Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb, a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. "Roll the stone aside," Jesus told them. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, "Lord, he has been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible." Jesus responded, "Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe?" So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here, so that they will believe you sent me." Then Jesus shouted, Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go."
All right, let's set the stage one more time. Mary and Martha's brother had died. And not only had he died, but before he died, or within a couple of days after he died, Mary and Martha still had hope that he might get better, that he might be brought back. And we know this because they sent for Jesus. But those hopes were dashed when 3 days passed and Jesus had not come yet. And not only were they mourning because their brother had died, but we've got to remember that we're talking about a time in history in which the men in a woman's life were the breadwinners of the family. And when your your husband or your brother or your uncle or your father, whoever's in charge of you, whoever is as the role of taking care of you dies, your options for feeding your family are pretty limited. And specifically, they're limited to either begging or resorting to methods that God had decreed to be sinful. We'll just leave it at that. In these sorts of situations, we might expect, we expect people not to be thinking clearly. We don't expect people to be in the midst of terrible grief and be thinking clearly. Or, I mean, we give people the grace and the freedom to react in ways that aren't logical, or to say or do things that they wouldn't normally do. But this is what makes this reality of we can totally understand why Mary and Martha would respond in the ways that they're responding. Maybe a little bit less so with the disciples, but still, we get it. But that's what makes how Jesus responds in these verses so not understandable. The text tells us that after Jesus looks around and sees the way that all of his friends are reacting in these circumstances, the disciples reacting in fear, and Martha reacting with resorting to shallow theological statements, and Mary in grief, and all those surrounding Mary in just overwhelming agony and grief, the text tells us that deep anger welled up within Jesus. And on the way to Lazarus' grave, we see Jesus weeping. And the part of us that wants to relate to Jesus here as a kind shepherd wants to interpret this anger as anger about the reality of sin and death in our world. Jesus, it welled up anger within him that sin and death exist. And we want to see Jesus weeping alongside those that he loved here. Even though he knows that he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead, he weeps alongside them. That's how we want to interpret this. But that's not what's going on here. The text infers that what's going on here, Jesus is not angry with sin and with the reality of sin and death. Jesus is angry at those who are with him. He's angry that he has spent so much time and so much energy investing in these people and working miracles in their presence and telling them who he is, and none of them in the midst of this are leaning in and trusting him. And we want to see Jesus on his way to visit Lazarus' grave, weeping alongside his friends, weeping and being empathetic to them. But John actually goes to great lengths to make it so that we don't connect what Jesus is doing with what Mary was doing. In fact, John even uses a different word for weep with describing what Jesus was doing and what everyone else was doing, because Jesus isn't weeping because he's sad. He's weeping because he's frustrated. He's frustrated that he spent so much time and so much energy investing in these people and walking with these people, and they're not leaning in. They're not grasping who he is and what that means in the midst of this situation. For those of us gathered here this morning, this is sort of a season of endings and also of beginnings. In one sense, it's a season of endings. This weekend marks the end of our series that we've been calling "Who is this Jesus?", where we're looking at who Jesus is, at least who the Gospel of John describes Jesus as being. But it's also a season of beginnings. This weekend marks the beginning of what hopefully will be the most restrictive season in this coronavirus, at least for us here in Minnesota. And so I'd like, as in our last discussion time, I'd like us to take just a moment and discuss how we can be supporting each other in the midst of this season, in the midst of a season where we want to lean in and trust Jesus, rather than than relying on our fears or our sadness, our feelings, or the easy answers to what's going on. And instead actually use this season as an opportunity to grow closer to Jesus and closer to each other, in a season that could so easily be marked by fear and frustration, instead to be marked by life and peace. Throughout this past series, we have asked the question, who is this Jesus that so defines who we are as his followers and as his church? Come back and be with us next week as we begin to work our way out of who is this Jesus, and begin to look at having looked at who Jesus is. What does that mean for who we are as followers of Jesus and also as the church of Jesus? It's going to be fun. If nothing else, it's going to be fun. We look forward to being back with you again next week. And as you hunker down this week, enjoy your time together and find ways to support and encourage each other, and to grow closer together as you grow closer to Jesus this week. Lord, we love you, and we every day we surrender ourselves to you. Use this week as an Ebenezer. Use this week as a mile marker in our lives, so that we can, for the rest of our lives, look back and claim this time of staying at home for coronavirus as the beginning of something fantastic, or as a mile marker of something fantastic in our lives. That is our prayer. We pray according to your character and your identity and your will and your calling. Amen.